The Consoling Thoughts of St. Francis de Sales. Consoling Thoughts on Trials of an Interior Life, Infirmities of Soul and Body, etc. Chapter 10. Advantages which we ought to draw from our defects. The matter on which I'm about to treat is one of the most important of a spiritual life. It is certain that in the views of God, the faults into which He permits us to fall should serve for our sanctification, and that it depends on ourselves to draw this advantage from them. What I have to say on this subject does not concern those cowardly and selfish souls who make reservations with God and who wish only to belong to Him to a certain degree. They commit, with foresight and reflection, 1,000 faults from which it is impossible they should derive any advantage, considering their evil dispositions. The persons for whom I write are those only who are determined not to commit any fault deliberately, though many escape them through surprise, inadvertence, and weakness, notwithstanding their resolution. It usually happens that such persons are astonished and troubled at their faults, conceive a false shame for them, and fall into vexation and discouragement. These are the effects of self-love, and are much more pernicious than the faults themselves. We are surprised at falling, an evident mark that we scarcely know ourselves. We ought, on the contrary, to be surprised at not falling more frequently, and into more grievous faults, and return thanks to God for the dangers from which He preserves us. We are troubled every time that we are beguiled into some fault, lose interior peace, are agitated, and spend hours, even days, thinking of it. We should never be troubled, but when we find ourselves on the ground, arise tranquilly, return to God with love, ask His forgiveness, and reflect no more on what has occurred, unless, when it is necessary, to accuse ourselves of it. We have a false shame for our faults. We can hardly venture to discover them to our confessor. Quote, "What idea will he have of me after so many promises, so many assurances I have given to him?" End quote. If you declare your faults simply and humbly, He will have more esteem for you. If you have a difficulty in telling them to Him, His confidence in you will diminish on account of your want of sincerity. But the worst of all is that we are vexed at being vexed, and impatient at being impatient. What a misery! Should we not see that this is pride? That we are humbled on finding ourselves less holy than we had imagined, that we aspire to be exempt from imperfections and faults only in order to applaud and congratulate ourselves on having spent one day or week without much matter of reproach? In fine, we are discouraged. We abandon our exercises one by one. We give up prayer. We regard perfection as impossible and despair of arriving at any such height. What will this constraint, we say, this continual watching over one's self, this struggle after recollection and mortification avail us, since we correct nothing, fall incessantly, and never become better? There is not a craftier snare of the demon than this. Would you wish to be protected from it? Never be discouraged, and no matter what fault you happen to commit, say, "Though I should fall 20 times, or 100 times a day, I will arise at every fall and pursue my course." What does it amount to, after all? That you should have met with some accidents on the way, provided you safely reach the journey's end. God will not reproach you after your recovery. Very often those mishaps proceed from the rapidity of our speed and from that ardor which prevents us from taking the necessary precautions. Timid and cautious souls who always wish to see where they put their foot, who turn aside every moment for fear of making a false step, who cannot bear to have their shoes soiled, never advance so quickly as others, who are less punctilious, but more daring, and whom death often overtakes in the midst of their course. It is not those who commit the least number of faults that are the most holy, but those who have the greatest courage, the greatest generosity, the greatest love, who make the boldest efforts to overcome themselves, and are not immoderately apprehensive of tripping, or even of falling and being dirtied a little, provided they advance. St. Paul has told us that everything turns to good for those who love God. Everything turns to their welfare, even their faults, and sometimes the most grievous faults. God permits those faults in order to heal a vain presumption and to teach us what we are and of what we are capable. David acknowledged that the adultery and homicide into which he had fallen served to keep him in continual distrust of himself. "It is a blessing for me," he says to God, "that thou hast humbled me. I have been more faithful since to thy commandments." The fall of St. Peter was a most useful lesson to him, and the humility with which it inspired him disposed him to receive the gifts of the Holy Ghost, and to become head of the Church, and preserved him amid the dangers of so eminent a position. St. Paul, during the period of his greatest success in the apostleship, preserved himself against pride and vanity by remembering that he had been a blasphemer and a persecutor of the Church of God. A humiliating temptation from which God would not deliver him served as a counterpoise to the sublimity of his revelations. If God knows how to draw advantage even from the greatest sins, who can suppose that he will fail to turn our daily faults to our sanctification? It is a remark made by the masters of a spiritual life that very often God leaves in the holiest souls some defects, which, notwithstanding all their endeavors, they cannot eradicate. He acts thus in order to make them feel their weakness, to show them what they would be without grace, to guard them from the inflation of vanity on account of his favors, to dispose them to receive other benefits with greater humility, to keep a holy self-hatred alive in their breasts, to withdraw them from the snares of self-love, to preserve their fervor and confidence towards him, and to teach them the necessity of having continual recourse to prayer. The child that tumbles when it wanders a little distance from its mother returns to her with greater tenderness, and from experience learns not to quit her in a hurry again. The lesson it has received on its own weakness and its mother's goodness inspires it with a livelier affection for her. The faults into which we fall often give place to great acts of virtue, which, otherwise, we should never have had occasion to practice, and God permits our faults for this end. For example, a dash of temper, a brusque reply, a manifest impatience just fits one for a good act of humility, which abundantly repairs the fault and the scandal it had given. The fault is committed by a sudden impulse. The reparation is made with reflection, by a victory over oneself, and with a full and deliberate will. The latter is an act much more agreeable to God than the former, as the fault was disagreeable to him. God makes use of our faults and apparent imperfections to conceal our sanctity from the eyes of others, and to procure us humiliations from them. God is a great master. Let us allow him to act. He will not fail at his work. Let us propose to ourselves to avoid carefully the least thing in the world that could displease him. But when we shall have fallen into some faults, let us be sorry on his account, not on our own. Let us cherish the abjection arising from our mishaps, and constantly beg of God to draw from them his own glory and our humiliation. He will do so, and advance us a great deal further by this means than by a life more regular and holy in appearance, but not so efficacious for the destruction of self-love. When God requires certain things from us, let us not retire under pretext of the faults we should commit in performing them. It is much better to do good with imperfection than to omit it. Sometimes we do not give a correction that is necessary through fear of being carried away by impatience. We avoid the conversation of certain persons whose faults offend and annoy us. But how shall we acquire virtues if we fly their occasions? Is not this a greater fault than that into which we fear to fall? Let us have a good intention. Attend where duty calls, and be satisfied that God is sufficiently indulgent to pardon us the faults into which his service and our desire of pleasing him expose us. Here ends the reading, and thanks be to God.